She was one of the most infamous criminals in American history. From the outside, she looked like a refined Southern woman, educated, well-spoken, even admired in political and social circles. But behind her carefully polished image, Georgia Tann was quietly building an empire of stolen children. Between the 1920s and 1950, she orchestrated one of the darkest criminal enterprises in the United States, selling babies to the wealthy while burying the evidence of those she deemed unworthy of life. If you're fascinated by how seemingly ordinary figures can hide the darkest crimes, make sure to like, share, subscribe, and click the notification bell. The Georgia Tann story is one you won't forget. Her story begins in 1891 in Philadelphia, Mississippi, where Beulah George Tann, later known simply as Georgia, was born. Her father was a respected judge, strict and commanding, a man who believed in appearances above all else. Her mother came from a wealthy family, providing her daughter with comfort, education, and status. To outsiders, the Tann household was respectable. Behind closed doors, it was a place where love was conditional, discipline harsh, and ambition demanded. Georgia's father dreamed of her becoming a concert pianist. She took piano lessons, studied classical music, and learned the elegance of Beethoven and Mozart. But Georgia was no ordinary child. Sharp, manipulative, and cold, she was less interested in the delicate life of music and more fascinated by control. While other girls were raised to become wives and homemakers, Georgia began shaping herself into something different. A woman determined to wield power in a world that told her she had none. By her teenage years, she was already showing signs of rebellion against expectations. Instead of fully embracing her father's vision of refinement, she developed her own ambitions. She would later study law and even pass the Mississippi bar exam, an extraordinary feat for a woman at the time. But her father refused to let her practice. He claimed the law was no place for women. That denial redirected her path into social work, a field considered respectable for women, but also one that gave her access to society's most vulnerable. That decision would change countless lives, because while Georgia Tann wore the face of compassion, she was quietly cultivating the traits of exploitation, manipulation, secrecy, and greed. She had learned early that appearances could be more powerful than truth, and she would use that lesson to devastating effect. Now, as you think about Georgia's beginnings, here's a question. Do you believe people are born with cruelty inside them? Or do circumstances and choices twist them into who they become? By 1909, Georgia Tann was a teenager with a sharp mind and a growing hunger for independence. She followed the path her father demanded, attending Martha Washington College in Virginia, where she studied piano and earned a degree in music. For most young women of that era, this was enough. A respectable education, followed by marriage, children, and a life defined by their husbands' names. But Georgia was restless. She didn't see music as a career or marriage as her destiny. Instead, she set her sights on something that almost no women dared to enter at the time: the law. In the early 1910s, Georgia began taking summer classes in New York, studying social justice and legal principles. With her father's connections, she managed to sit for the Mississippi bar exam, and to the shock of many, she passed. She became licensed to practice law in Mississippi, a remarkable achievement in an age when women were barely tolerated in courtrooms, much less expected to stand at the front as attorneys. But her father crushed that ambition. "The law is no place for a woman," he told her, forbidding her from practicing. For Georgia, it was another humiliation, another reminder that no matter how capable she was, the world intended to keep her in its place. Denied the career she wanted, Georgia accepted what society deemed respectable: social work. It was a field dominated by women, framed as an extension of maternal instincts and nurturing roles. But for Georgia, it became something else entirely. Where others saw charity, she saw loopholes. Where others saw vulnerable families, she saw opportunity. By 1922, she was hired by the Mississippi Children's Home Society, a private agency tasked with placing orphans and abandoned children with adoptive families. On paper, it was noble work. In reality, adoption at the time was chaotic and unregulated. There were no federal laws governing adoption, few state guidelines, and almost no enforcement. Private agencies could operate as they pleased, with minimal oversight. It was a perfect environment for someone like Georgia Tann. First, she appeared to be an ideal hire. Educated, confident, and authoritative, she commanded respect among colleagues. Her role was to place children into suitable homes, but Georgia's definition of suitable quickly raised questions. Supervisors began noticing irregularities. Families were chosen not for their character, but for appearances, wealth, or connections. Paperwork went missing. Children were placed without proper documentation. By 1924, just 2 years after she'd been hired, the agency quietly let her go. The official explanation: mismanagement and questionable practices. But no charges were filed. No public warnings were issued. Georgia left Mississippi with her reputation mostly intact, and with hard lessons learned. She now understood two things. First, that children could be treated as commodities, and second, that oversight was weak enough for someone bold enough to exploit it. The next time she entered social work, she promised herself no one would stop her, because Georgia Tann wasn't finished. In fact, she was just beginning. Do you think Georgia was already planning her criminal empire at this stage? Or was it her frustrations and opportunities that pushed her further down that path? In 1924, Georgia Tann left Mississippi behind. To most, she was simply another social worker who hadn't worked out. But to Georgia, her dismissal was a turning point. She had tested the system, bent the rules, and learned how much she could get away with. Now, she needed a stage large enough to match her ambitions. That stage would be Memphis, Tennessee. Memphis in the 1920s was a city ruled not by elected officials, but by one man, E.H. Crump. Known as Boss Crump, he was a political powerhouse who controlled everything from elections to city contracts. If you wanted influence in Memphis, you went through him. Georgia Tann understood power, and she knew she had to align herself with it. Soon after arriving, she charmed her way into elite social circles. She attended parties where she played Beethoven sonatas, projecting an image of refinement. She wore tailored dresses, carried herself with dignity, and cultivated the persona of a woman dedicated to children's welfare. It wasn't long before she caught the attention of Memphis's leaders, and Crump himself. That connection opened doors. Later in 1924, Georgia was hired by the Tennessee Children's Home Society as a social worker. Within just a few years, she was promoted to executive director. It was a meteoric rise, but few questioned it. She was efficient, ambitious, and seemed to dedicate her life to the cause of children. Behind the polished image, Georgia was laying the foundation for something far darker. Tennessee law limited adoption agencies to a small administrative fee, around $7 per adoption. But Georgia saw an opportunity. Wealthy families in states like New York and California desperately wanted children. Many were willing to pay thousands of dollars under the table to get them. With privacy laws so lax that records could be sealed or destroyed without oversight, Georgia realized she could operate almost in the shadows. And she wouldn't be alone. She built a network of allies, including Judge Camille Kelly, a juvenile court judge who became her most important partner. Kelly could sign off on custody transfers without hearings, without appeals, without anyone questioning the legality. With a stroke of her pen, parental rights were terminated, and Georgia had another child to sell. At first, her operation was small, but under the protection of Crump's political machine, Georgia grew bolder. Soon, children were being taken from hospitals, maternity wards, and poor mothers, often under false pretenses or outright lies. Families were told their babies had died, when in reality, they were being funneled into Georgia's adoption network. By the late 1920s, Georgia Tann had transformed adoption into big business, and she was only getting started. Do you think Georgia's success was more about her personal cunning, or about the corrupt system that enabled her to thrive? By the late 1920s, Georgia Tann had secured her position as the head of the Tennessee Children's Home Society. With Judge Camille Kelly's legal backing and Boss Crump's political protection, she operated with almost no oversight. On the surface, she ran a respected adoption agency. In reality, it was becoming the largest black market baby ring in American history. Here's how it worked. Georgia and her staff targeted poor mothers, single women, and vulnerable families. Sometimes the mothers were told their children had died at birth. Other times, they were coerced into signing documents they couldn't read, believing they were authorizing medical care when they were actually signing away parental rights. In some cases, babies were simply taken from hospitals before their mothers ever saw them. Once Georgia had the children, she focused on appearances. She favored blonde-haired, blue-eyed babies, whom she considered the most marketable. Children who didn't meet her standards were neglected or discarded, fueling one of the highest infant mortality rates in the country. To wealthy adoptive parents, Georgia presented herself as a savior. She marketed her services to judges, lawyers, Hollywood actors, and politicians. She charged adoptive families thousands of dollars, sometimes as much as $10,000 per child, while officially recording only the $7 fee allowed by law. The rest went directly into her pockets and into the machine that kept her protected. Her clients included some of the most prominent names of the era. Actress Joan Crawford adopted twins through Georgia's network. Other celebrities and high-profile figures quietly turned to her when they wanted children. To them, she was a miracle worker. To the real mothers, she was a thief. And yet, in Memphis, Georgia maintained her reputation as a respected woman. She drove fine cars, attended the most exclusive social events, and presented herself as a pioneer in child welfare. The city praised her for helping children. The truth was buried under forged documents, sealed records, and silent victims. By the early 1930s, her network stretched across multiple states. Children from Tennessee were being sent to New York, California, and beyond. Each adoption brought her more wealth, more power, and more untouchable influence. But behind the polished image and glowing headlines, graves were already filling with the children who didn't survive her care. Georgia Tann was building her empire on lies, loss, and death, and almost no one dared to question her. If you had lived in Memphis in the 1930s, do you think you would have believed Georgia's image as a child savior? Or would you have suspected the truth behind her polished reputation? Before we go further into how Georgia's empire grew, and the chilling methods she used to keep her crimes hidden, make sure you like this video, share it with others who care about true crime history, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. These stories matter because they remind us how dangerous unchecked power can be. By the early 1930s, Georgia Tann's network had grown so vast that ordinary adoptions could no longer sustain it. She needed a steady supply of children, and she knew exactly where to find them. Her targets were the most vulnerable: poor mothers, unmarried women, and patients in institutions. In maternity wards, nurses on her payroll would tell mothers their babies had died. In reality, the infants were handed over to Georgia's staff before the mothers could even hold them. In mental institutions, young women who became pregnant, sometimes from abuse within those facilities, had their children taken without a trace. Georgia's methods were as cruel as they were efficient. She branded poor women as unfit to be mothers, citing poverty, lack of education, or social status. Judge Camille Kelly signed orders terminating parental rights without hearings, without appeals, and often without parents even knowing. Once those papers were signed, the children were considered legally free for Georgia to sell. The system had no safeguards. Adoption records were falsified, destroyed, or sealed. Birth certificates were rewritten to erase the biological parents, ensuring the truth could never be traced. Children grew up never knowing where they came from, and mothers spent lifetimes wondering what happened to their babies. Meanwhile, Georgia played the role of a reformer. She traveled across the country giving lectures on modern adoption practices. Newspapers praised her as a pioneer. Families who received children from her agency believed they had been given a miracle. Few realized the miracle came at the expense of broken mothers, stolen children, and graves hidden in plain sight. The darker side of her empire was becoming undeniable. Babies considered too weak, too sick, or too undesirable were often neglected until they died. By the mid-1930s, the Tennessee Children's Home Society had the highest infant mortality rate in the United States. Many of those children were buried in unmarked graves, their short lives forgotten except for the paperwork Georgia filed to cover her tracks. Still, she was untouchable. With Boss Crump's political protection, Judge Kelly's legal authority, and her own carefully crafted image, Georgia Tann continued to expand. Each year, more children vanished from hospitals, homes, and institutions, funneled into an adoption pipeline that made her rich and powerful, and the public applauded her for it. Do you think people in Memphis truly didn't know what was happening? Or did they choose to look the other way because Georgia Tann's image was too powerful to question? By the mid-1930s, Georgia Tann had perfected her operation. She no longer thought of it as adoption work, it was a business, and business was booming. But what truly elevated her empire was her ability to attract powerful, wealthy clients from across the United States. Georgia understood appearances better than anyone. To the Memphis poor, she was a predator. To society's elite, she was a miracle worker. She cultivated connections with judges, politicians, and celebrities, presenting herself as the only woman who could place the right child into the right home. One of her most famous clients was Hollywood actress Joan Crawford, who adopted twins through Georgia's network. Other well-known figures, including movie stars, writers, and even politicians, quietly turned to her when they wanted children. They didn't ask too many questions about where the babies came from, and Georgia never volunteered the truth. She marketed her services to adoptive parents with brochures and personal assurances that the children were carefully chosen and from the finest backgrounds. In reality, most of the children had been taken from poor families who never agreed to give them up. But the sealed records ensured no one would ever know. The money pouring in was staggering. Families paid thousands of dollars in cash under the table, believing it to be an agency fee. Georgia kept almost all of it, reporting only the official $7 adoption fee required by Tennessee law. Estimates suggest she personally pocketed millions of dollars over the course of her career, a fortune in Depression-era America. Her influence reached far beyond Memphis. With Boss Crump's political machine shielding her and Judge Camille Kelly rubber-stamping her custody transfers, Georgia operated with impunity. She presented herself as a national authority on adoption, giving lectures and writing articles that were widely praised. Newspapers described her as a pioneer. Social workers cited her as a role model. But behind the glowing headlines, the truth was horrific. Babies considered too frail or unmarketable often died under her watch. Children old enough to remember their families were forcibly silenced, their identities erased. Siblings were separated, never to see each other again. And grieving parents were left with only lies, told their babies had died or that the state had deemed them unfit. Georgia thrived in this dual world, admired reformer to the powerful, silent thief to the powerless. She lived in luxury, driving fine cars, owning vacation homes, and hosting elegant gatherings. Outwardly, she was the very picture of respectability. But every dollar she earned was stained with loss. Every smile she showed at a public event was built on the silence of mothers who would never see their children again. How do you think Georgia Tann managed to fool so many powerful people for so long? Was it her charm, or their willingness not to question what was too convenient? By the late 1930s, Georgia Tann's operation had reached its peak. What began as a modest adoption agency in Memphis had transformed into a vast network that stretched across multiple states. She had supply lines in hospitals, maternity wards, and even mental institutions. Everywhere society placed its most vulnerable, Georgia saw opportunity. Her staff worked like hunters. Nurses were bribed to tell mothers their babies had died. Doctors were persuaded to sign false death certificates. Social workers under her authority scouted poor neighborhoods, looking for struggling families she could brand as unfit. All it took was one court order from Judge Camille Kelly, and a child was hers to sell. The Tennessee Children's Home Society became the epicenter of this black market empire. Behind its polished doors, children were processed like inventory. Files were falsified, birth records destroyed, and new identities assigned. Babies were given to adoptive families who believed they were doing a noble thing, never realizing the child's mother had been tricked or robbed. The scale was staggering. At the height of her power, Georgia was placing hundreds of children a year into homes across the United States. Wealthy families in California, New York, and beyond saw her as a miracle worker. To the press, she was a reformer who gave children better lives. To the powerless families of Memphis, she was a thief who stole futures. But there was another side, the part Georgia never wanted exposed. Many children didn't survive long enough to be adopted. The Tennessee Children's Home Society became notorious for its high infant mortality rate. Babies who were sick, disabled, or simply not desirable enough often received no care at all. Some were neglected until they died. Others were buried quietly, without headstones, their existence erased. Still, Georgia thrived, protected by her political connections, praised in the press, and admired by adoptive parents. She lived in luxury while the graves filled. The city of Memphis continued to honor her, calling her a champion for children. No one dared to challenge her openly, and those who might have suspected the truth often stayed silent. Georgia's network was too powerful, her influence too wide. For a woman who built her career on appearances, it was working. She looked like a savior. Only the families left behind knew she was anything but. Do you think Georgia Tann believed she was helping children in her own twisted way? Or did she always know she was nothing more than a criminal hiding behind respectability? By the late 1930s, Georgia Tann's reputation had spread far beyond Memphis. To the public, she wasn't just a social worker. She was the woman who had revolutionized adoption. In truth, she had transformed it into a lucrative nationwide business, one that reached the highest levels of society. Her network no longer stopped at Tennessee. Wealthy couples from New York, California, and across the United States contacted her directly. Georgia promised healthy, beautiful babies, and she delivered at a price. Some adoptive parents paid thousands in fees, believing it was legitimate. In reality, Georgia was pocketing a fortune. Among her most famous clients was actress Joan Crawford, who adopted twin girls through Georgia's agency. Other Hollywood stars and prominent politicians also turned to her, each believing they were working with a respected reformer. Every glowing newspaper article about Georgia's adoption miracles only strengthened her untouchable image. But for every smiling family photograph that appeared in society pages, there were mothers in Memphis mourning children they had been told were dead. Georgia had mastered the art of deception. Birth certificates were rewritten. Records were sealed or destroyed. Entire identities were erased with the stroke of a pen. Children grew up never knowing the truth, and parents lived the rest of their lives haunted by lies. What made Georgia even more dangerous was her ability to manipulate both sides of the system. She presented herself as compassionate to adoptive families, while wielding fear and intimidation against poor mothers. To the powerful, she was a savior. To the powerless, she was a nightmare. The money rolling in allowed her to live lavishly. She drove luxury cars, owned vacation homes, and hosted society gatherings, all while her agency was responsible for one of the highest infant mortality rates in the country. Babies deemed too sick, too weak, or too undesirable simply didn't survive. They were buried in unmarked graves, their short lives erased as if they had never existed. Yet no one stopped her. Judge Camille Kelly's signatures kept the custody transfers flowing. Boss Crump's political protection shielded her from scrutiny. And the adoptive families, desperate for children, never questioned the methods. Georgia Tann had built a criminal empire in plain sight, and most of America applauded her for it. If you were an adoptive parent in the 1930s and 40s, would you have questioned Georgia's methods? Or would her polished image have convinced you she was doing the right thing? Before we continue deeper into how Georgia's crimes grew darker and the shocking discoveries that would eventually expose her, take a second to like, share, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. These stories matter because they remind us how power and respectability can hide the worst kinds of crimes. For every child Georgia Tann placed in a wealthy home, there were others who never left the Tennessee Children's Home Society alive. Behind the polished image of an adoption pioneer lay one of the darkest truths of her empire: the staggering number of children who died under her care. By the mid-1930s, the Tennessee Children's Home Society had one of the highest infant mortality rates in the United States. Babies who were sick, disabled, or deemed unmarketable were often neglected until they wasted away. Some were denied food, others medical care. In Georgia's eyes, if a child couldn't bring in money, they weren't worth saving. When these children died, their deaths were often hidden. Records were falsified, cause of death misreported, and bodies quietly buried. Sometimes they were cremated in local funeral homes without any paperwork. Other times they were placed in unmarked graves. The most notorious burial site was in Elmwood Cemetery in Memphis, where 19 children were buried together in a single plot. For decades, their graves were unmarked, their names erased. To outsiders, Georgia continued to be celebrated as a hero. Newspapers praised her for modernizing adoption. Wealthy parents paraded the children she provided, never realizing how many others had been discarded. In speeches, Georgia spoke of giving children better lives. In reality, she decided who was worthy of life and who was not. Families who lost children to her lies carried their grief in silence. Poor mothers were told their babies had died at birth, but sometimes those babies hadn't. They had been sold, their identities rewritten. The mothers mourned children who were alive in other states, raised by strangers, while babies who truly died were buried without dignity. The cruelty was staggering, and yet Georgia thrived. Her home society operated in plain sight, her political allies kept her untouchable, and her image remained polished. Few dared to question her methods, even as whispers grew about the number of children vanishing or dying in her care. The city of Memphis, blinded by appearances and political power, allowed her crimes to continue unchecked. Every unmarked grave, every missing record, every silenced child was another layer of the empire Georgia Tann had built, and the world still called her a reformer. Do you think Georgia truly believed she was helping most of the children? Or did she know her actions were nothing more than cruelty disguised as care? By the late 1930s, Georgia Tann had become more than a local figure. She was now a national authority on adoption. Her reputation as a reformer spread far beyond Tennessee, cemented by her political allies and her ability to charm influential audiences. She traveled the country, giving lectures on what she called progressive child welfare. She claimed she was rescuing children from poverty, providing them with opportunities they would never have otherwise. Newspapers ran flattering profiles, presenting her as a pioneer who had transformed adoption into a modern practice. Few questioned her methods. Even fewer understood the scope of her deception. Her influence reached the highest levels of government. Georgia attended conferences alongside leaders in Washington. She was introduced to First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who admired her apparent dedication to children. President Harry Truman even sought her advice on adoption reform. To the nation, she looked like a woman devoted to compassion and justice. But the truth, hidden behind sealed records and falsified documents, was that Georgia was selling children like merchandise. Wealthy families who paid thousands in cash under the table praised her. Poor families who had been lied to, told their children had died or taken from them without consent, were erased from the story. Georgia used every tool of propaganda to protect her image. She placed advertisements in newspapers across the country, offering children for adoption as if they were part of a raffle or lottery. In some cases, she charged up to $10,000 per child, a staggering sum in Depression-era America. The official fee recorded by Tennessee law remained $7. Everything else was profit. Behind closed doors, however, the reality of her empire was horrific. Children who didn't fit her ideal mold were neglected or left to die. Siblings were split apart forever. Mothers spent their lives searching for children who were alive in other states under new names. And through it all, Georgia lived in luxury. Chauffeured cars, expensive homes, fine clothing. The portrait of success built on stolen lives. What made her so dangerous was not just her cruelty, but her ability to hide it behind respectability. To most Americans, she was a hero. To thousands of children and parents, she was a thief. And still, no one stopped her. Why do you think society in the 1930s and 40s was so quick to accept Georgia's image as a reformer? Was it her charm, or the public's willingness to believe a respectable woman couldn't possibly be evil? By the early 1940s, Georgia Tann's empire reached its peak. The Tennessee Children's Home Society in Memphis had become the largest child adoption agency in the United States. Her influence stretched across 48 states, and thousands of children passed through her control. But while her reputation soared, the hidden toll grew unbearable. Reports from nurses and social workers who briefly worked under her painted a grim picture. Overcrowded nurseries, infants packed into cribs meant for one, children starving, and disease spreading unchecked. Those who spoke up didn't last long. Georgia used her political power to silence dissenters, firing critics or having them blacklisted from child welfare work. Her selection process was chilling. Babies with blonde hair and blue eyes were considered premium and sold for the highest fees. Children with darker features, disabilities, or illnesses were often neglected, left to die, or never placed at all. If a baby failed to meet her standards, they were written off as unworthy. The death rate soared. In some years, nearly 50 children died in her care. Their lives ended in silence, their identities erased by falsified paperwork. Some were buried in unmarked graves at Elmwood Cemetery, where decades later, investigators discovered a mass grave holding the remains of 19 children. The marker, erected much later, would read only, "In memory of the 19 children who finally rest here." The truth was hidden too long. And yet, Georgia continued to be praised. Adoption had become fashionable among the wealthy, and she supplied the demand. Hollywood stars, politicians, and powerful families, many unknowingly, obtained children through her pipeline. To them, she was delivering happiness. To the children and parents left behind, she was tearing families apart. The contradictions of Georgia Tann's empire revealed the darkest side of unchecked power. She could be photographed smiling at charity events while, at that very moment, children under her roof were dying from neglect. And still, the city of Memphis looked away. The deeper question lingered. How long could she hide the truth before it finally came crashing down? If you had lived in Memphis in the 1940s and heard whispers of so many children dying in state care, would you have believed them or trusted the polished image Georgia Tann projected? By the mid-1940s, cracks were beginning to form in Georgia Tann's carefully polished empire. Rumors had been swirling for years. Whispers of missing paperwork, infants dying at alarming rates, and families who claimed their children had been stolen. But Georgia was still protected by her political allies and her powerful reputation as the nation's adoption reformer. Behind the scenes, however, some officials were quietly paying attention. A few judges, social workers, and journalists began to piece together what many had feared. The Tennessee Children's Home Society wasn't a charity at all. It was a business, a criminal operation hiding under the cloak of respectability. Former staff members who escaped Georgia's reach started speaking out. They described nurseries so overcrowded that babies suffocated in their cribs. They told of children locked in hot rooms with no ventilation during the Memphis summers, some of them dying from heat stroke. They described records that were deliberately falsified, birth certificates rewritten, names changed, and family histories erased. Meanwhile, desperate mothers were coming forward with hauntingly similar stories. They had been told their newborns had died, but years later, whispers suggested their babies had been adopted out to wealthy families. For some, it was too painful to believe. For others, it was the first confirmation that their grief had been built on lies. Still, Georgia thrived. She remained untouchable, even as the evidence of abuse mounted. She continued to move through society's highest circles, smiling for photographs, shaking hands with politicians, and presenting herself as the savior of orphans. But the tide was slowly turning. The number of children dying under her care could no longer be hidden. Investigators began pulling records, journalists started asking sharper questions, and whispers of an inquiry grew louder. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, Georgia Tann's empire of stolen children was in danger. Before we continue, take a second to subscribe and turn on notifications. These stories are not just history, they are warnings about what happens when power goes unchecked. By following this series, you'll help keep the memory of the victims alive. Do you think the system protected Georgia Tann because she was truly convincing, or because too many powerful people benefited from her crimes? Before we continue, take a second to like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications. These stories are not just history, they are warnings about what happens when power goes unchecked. By following this story, you'll help keep the memory of the victims alive. By 1947, Georgia Tann's empire was running out of places to hide. For years, she had controlled the narrative, silencing critics with her political connections and presenting herself as a hero to the public. But in the shadows, investigators were finally closing in. The governor of Tennessee, Gordon Browning, had begun hearing repeated complaints about corruption in state institutions. Adoption records, in particular, raised alarms. Families reported strange irregularities. Paperwork that didn't match, children listed as deceased who were later discovered alive, and outrageous sums of money changing hands under the table. At the center of almost every complaint stood the name Georgia Tann. The first breakthrough came from records at local hospitals. Nurses began speaking up about infants being taken from mothers without consent, often while the women were still recovering from childbirth. In some cases, mothers were told their babies had died, only to discover later there was no death certificate on file. Instead, adoption papers appeared, signed by Georgia's allies. Even more damning was the financial trail. While Tennessee law limited adoption fees to a small administrative cost, families across the country reported paying thousands to Georgia Tann in cash. Some said they were pressured into donations as high as $5,000 or $10,000. Sums that would equal well over $100,000 today. None of that money was reported to the state. Investigators also uncovered evidence of forged documents. Birth certificates were routinely altered to erase a child's origins. Siblings were separated and given false names. The goal was clear: to make the trail impossible for birth families to follow, ensuring that once a child left Tennessee, they were lost forever. Meanwhile, whispers of the death toll grew harder to ignore. Mortality reports from the Tennessee Children's Home Society revealed shocking numbers. Some years, more than 40 children died under Georgia's care, far higher than any other facility in the state. Officials began to suspect that neglect wasn't the only cause. It was becoming impossible to dismiss the pattern. Georgia Tann was no benevolent reformer. She was running a criminal empire in plain sight, and for the first time, people in power were willing to confront her. What do you think finally pushed officials to act? The money trail, the high death rates, or the courage of mothers who refused to stay silent? In 1949, Governor Gordon Browning could no longer ignore the evidence piling up against Georgia Tann. Complaints from families, whispers of corruption, and shocking mortality numbers forced him to take action. He quietly ordered a full-scale investigation into the Tennessee Children's Home Society. What investigators uncovered would horrify the nation. Led by attorney Robert L. Taylor, the inquiry pulled thousands of records from the agency. The findings were staggering. At least 5,000 children had passed through Georgia's hands, many of them taken by deception or outright force. Mothers were coerced into signing papers they couldn't read. Others were told their newborns had died, only for the babies to be sold to wealthy families across the country. The financial evidence was just as damning. Adoption fees, legally capped at a few dollars, had ballooned into thousands. Georgia was pocketing the difference, amassing a personal fortune. Investigators concluded she had made more than $1 million, the equivalent of nearly $12 million today. But perhaps the most shocking revelation came from the mortality records. Between 1945 and 1950, more than 500 children died while in Georgia's custody. Many deaths were linked to neglect, disease, and malnutrition. Some infants were deliberately starved or denied medical treatment because they weren't considered adoptable. Investigators found falsified death certificates, missing burial records, and reports of children buried in unmarked graves. The image of Georgia Tann as a benevolent reformer crumbled overnight. Newspapers that once praised her began running exposés. Families across America were horrified to learn their adoptions might have been built on lies. Politicians who had supported her distanced themselves, though many had benefited from her schemes. And yet, despite the mountain of evidence, Georgia Tann still had not faced justice. Her network of allies had protected her for nearly 3 decades. But now, with the governor himself exposing her crimes, The empire she built on stolen children was collapsing. The question was no longer if Georgia would be stopped, but whether she would live to face the punishment she deserved. Do you think Georgia's crimes would have been exposed sooner if she hadn't been so deeply connected to politicians and judges? When the findings of the 1949 investigation were made public, Memphis was shaken to its core. For nearly 3 decades, Georgia Tann had been hailed as a visionary, a woman who rescued children from poverty. But the official report revealed the truth. She had trafficked thousands of children, lied to families, and allowed hundreds to die under her care. Headlines across the country screamed the news. Child theft ring exposed. One read, "Memphis woman sold babies for profit," said another. Families who had worked with Georgia were stunned. Adoptive parents wondered if the babies they had paid thousands for had been stolen. Birth mothers who had been told their children had died now faced the unbearable possibility that their sons or daughters were alive, raised by strangers. Survivors began to speak out. Mothers recalled how Georgia's social workers appeared at hospitals and maternity wards, pressuring poor women to sign papers they couldn't understand. Some were sedated and told later that their newborns hadn't survived. Fathers recalled being tricked or intimidated into giving up their children. And siblings, separated forever, described the pain of knowing their brothers and sisters had been scattered across the country, their identities erased. The public outrage was immediate, but justice moved slowly. Georgia's network had been so entrenched, her influence so strong, that even with overwhelming evidence, many of her political allies tried to minimize the scandal. Some claimed she had only made mistakes. Others argued that many children had ended up in good homes, as though that excused the crimes. Meanwhile, the children themselves were left in limbo. Those who survived grew up carrying deep scars, questions about their real names, their true families, and the trauma of being treated like commodities. Some learned the truth decades later when adoption records were unsealed, while others never discovered their origins at all. For the people of Memphis, the betrayal cut deep. Georgia Tann hadn't just stolen children. She had stolen trust. She had corrupted courts, hospitals, and even the idea of adoption itself. And as the scandal grew, the question everyone asked was simple. Would Georgia Tann finally face justice? If you were an adoptive parent during that time, would you want to know if your child had been stolen, even if it meant shattering your family's foundation? By the fall of 1949, the walls were closing in on Georgia Tann. The investigation had exposed her empire of lies. Families across America were reeling from the revelations. The press no longer called her a reformer. Now they called her what she truly was, a trafficker of children. Governor Gordon Browning announced the findings publicly, stating that Georgia had sold children like merchandise, and that her crimes had blackened the good name of Tennessee. For a woman who had built her life on appearances, it was the ultimate humiliation. And yet, just as prosecutors were preparing to press charges, fate intervened. In September 1950, Georgia Tann was diagnosed with uterine cancer. Within weeks, her health collapsed. On September 15, 1950, she died at the age of 59, taking countless secrets with her to the grave. For many of her victims, her death was a cruel twist. She never faced a courtroom. She never stood before the families she deceived. She never answered for the hundreds of children who died under her watch. Justice, in the eyes of many, had been denied, but her empire collapsed with her. The Tennessee Children's Home Society in Memphis was shut down. Adoption laws across the United States began to change, with new emphasis on transparency, oversight, and ethical practices. Georgia's crimes had forced the nation to confront how easily vulnerable children could be exploited when power went unchecked. Still, the damage was permanent. Thousands of children grew up never knowing the truth of their origins. Birth families carried grief that lasted lifetimes. And even today, survivors continue to piece together the fragments of stolen identities, trying to reconnect with the families they were torn from. Georgia Tann escaped the justice system, but not history. Her name has become synonymous with corruption, cruelty, and the darkest side of adoption. Do you think Georgia's death spared her from the punishment she deserved? Or was the public exposure of her crimes the harshest judgment she could have saved? Before we continue to the final stretch of the story, take a moment to like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Stories like this are painful but necessary, and by sharing them, you help honor the memory of every child who suffered under Georgia Tann's empire. When Georgia Tann died in 1950, she left behind more than just a scandal. She left behind a trail of broken lives. The Tennessee Children's Home Society was permanently closed, but the truth of what had happened inside those walls was only beginning to surface. Investigators uncovered horrifying records. At least 5,000 children had been processed through Georgia's operation. Some were sold to wealthy families in Hollywood and New York. Others were adopted by middle-class couples who had no idea they were complicit in child trafficking. And tragically, hundreds of children died in her care. The evidence was chilling. Files showed children labeled as unadoptable were often neglected, starved, or deliberately left untreated when ill. The infant mortality rate inside the home was the highest in the country. Many of those children were quietly buried, their graves unmarked, their names erased. One of the most haunting discoveries came decades later at Elmwood Cemetery in Memphis. Buried beneath a small 14 by 13-foot plot were the remains of 19 children who had died under Georgia's watch. For years, their graves lay unmarked, forgotten. In 2015, a monument was finally erected, etched with the words, "In memory of the 19 children who finally rest here, and all the others who remain unknown." Survivors of Georgia's adoption schemes began coming forward. Many had grown up in loving homes but carried the ache of unanswered questions about their birth families. Others endured abuse from adoptive parents, chosen only for their wealth and not their capacity to love. Reunions, when they happened, were bittersweet. A mixture of joy, grief, and anger for the years that could never be reclaimed. For birth parents, the wounds cut even deeper. Some had been tricked into signing papers they couldn't read. Others had been told their babies had died at birth, only to discover decades later that their children had been sold. The betrayal was staggering. Though Georgia Tann was gone, her crimes forced America to face a new reality. Adoption needed oversight. In the years after her death, states across the U.S. began introducing stricter laws, background checks, and regulations to prevent another Tennessee scandal. Adoption would never be the same, but for many families, the reforms came too late. Their children were gone, their names lost in sealed records and altered birth certificates, and the woman who orchestrated it all never spent a single day in prison. Q, do you believe Georgia Tann's legacy should be taught in schools as part of American history? Or is it too dark a chapter for classrooms? By the 1960s and 70s, whispers of Georgia Tann's crimes began spreading beyond Tennessee. Survivors, children who had once been stolen and sold, started to search for the truth of their origins. Many discovered that their adoption records were falsified, their birth names erased, and their parents listed as unknown. For some, the truth surfaced by accident. A woman in California, adopted through Georgia's network, recalled opening a locked box in her parents' attic. Inside were papers that contradicted everything she'd been told about her adoption. Instead of being unwanted, she learned her mother had been tricked into signing away her rights after being told her baby had died. That mother was still alive and searching for her child. Their reunion decades later was filled with tears, joy, and anger at the woman who had stolen so much time. Others were not as fortunate. Many adoptive families had burned the paperwork, unwilling to let their children know they had been purchased. Some survivors never found their birth families, lost forever in a web of lies Georgia had carefully spun. The emotional scars of being sold haunted them for life. But out of this darkness, voices began to rise. Survivors formed networks, reaching out across states and decades to find one another. Their stories gained traction in newspapers, television specials, and court testimonies. Each testimony painted the same picture. Georgia Tann had not been a savior of orphans. She had been a trafficker, a manipulator, and a thief of childhoods. The public began to demand answers. Why hadn't the government acted sooner? Why were records sealed? And how many powerful people had known about Georgia's crimes yet looked away? For many survivors, speaking out was not just about reclaiming their stories. It was about honoring the children who didn't survive, the ones buried in unmarked graves, the ones who never grew old enough to ask questions. Their voices became the echo of justice long denied. The Tennessee government eventually issued a public acknowledgement of Georgia Tann's crimes, calling them one of the darkest chapters in American child welfare history. But for many, the apology felt hollow. No one was ever prosecuted. No restitution was offered. Georgia had died a wealthy woman, untouchable to the end. Still, survivors refused to let their stories vanish. They became the living proof of her crimes, and the force that kept her legacy from being erased. If you were one of Georgia Tann's survivors, would you want to uncover the truth, even if it meant reopening decades of pain? The storm of revelations surrounding Georgia Tann's empire forced America to confront an ugly truth. For decades, the adoption system had been built on shadows. Her network wasn't just an isolated scandal in Tennessee. It had exposed the dangerous lack of oversight across the entire country. Lawmakers could no longer ignore the consequences. Beginning in the late 1950s and accelerating through the 1960s, states began drafting stronger adoption laws. Tennessee, under pressure from survivors and journalists, took the first steps. New statutes required stricter documentation, mandatory background checks for adoptive parents, and legal representation for biological mothers to prevent coercion. Other states followed. By the 1970s, adoption agencies nationwide were required to meet higher standards of transparency, with state and federal oversight increasing. Birth certificates could no longer be falsified as easily, and the practice of sealing all adoption records began to face intense scrutiny. Still, for thousands of children who had passed through Georgia's hands, it was too late. Their identities had been permanently altered, their pasts erased. But Georgia's legacy carried a dual weight: horror and reform. Politicians who once praised her as a pioneer now distanced themselves, rebranding adoption laws to emphasize child welfare and ethical practice. Training programs for social workers began incorporating her crimes as a warning of what unchecked power could do. Yet the reforms didn't erase the pain. Survivors still encountered locked doors when seeking their true identities. Many records remained sealed, citing privacy. For those who had grown up believing they were abandoned, only to discover they were stolen, the injustice was doubled. First by Georgia's hand, then by the state's refusal to give them answers. Faith-based organizations and advocacy groups began fighting on their behalf. They pushed for open adoption records laws, arguing that every child had the right to know their origins. Slowly, states began unsealing some files, though the progress was uneven. Georgia Tann was dead, but her shadow lingered in courtrooms, in adoption agencies, and in the lives of the children she had trafficked. The very word adoption carried a weight of suspicion for decades because of her. Her case became a grim reminder that even systems built to protect children could be corrupted when money and influence took precedence over humanity. Do you think adoption records should always remain open to protect children from secrets, or should families have the right to keep them closed? By the 1980s, Georgia Tann's name had become synonymous with corruption in child welfare. Survivors were no longer silent. They were telling their stories to journalists, television producers, and anyone who would listen. Books and documentaries began to emerge, each peeling back another layer of the horror. Former Tann children testified about how they were told their mothers didn't want them, only to learn decades later they had been stolen. Others recalled growing up in wealthy families, showered with material comfort, but feeling the ache of something missing, a truth buried in locked files. Journalists unearthed documents once thought destroyed, revealing how deep her connections ran. Judges, politicians, even Hollywood stars had benefited from her network. The scandal wasn't just Tennessee's, it was America's. The idea that thousands of families had unknowingly participated in child trafficking under the guise of adoption shook the nation. Out of the pain, survivor groups began forming support networks. They organized reunions, created databases, and demanded governments unseal records. Each reunion carried both joy and sorrow. Joy at finding a mother, brother, or sister after decades apart, and sorrow for the years that could never be reclaimed. Meanwhile, scholars and reformers began using Georgia's case as a teaching tool. Her crimes became the cautionary tale that reshaped the ethics of adoption in the United States. New training programs for social workers, child advocates, and judges cited her story as proof that unchecked authority could devastate lives. But perhaps the most enduring legacy came not from the lawmakers, but from the survivors themselves. By sharing their voices, they ensured Georgia Tann's empire would never again be hidden in shadows. Their truth turned into a movement, one that demanded compassion, transparency, and justice in every adoption. The world would never see Georgia Tann face a courtroom, but every testimony, every reunion, every uncovered record became part of the justice she was denied. If you uncovered a secret like this in your own family history, would you want to know, no matter how painful it might be? If you believe these hidden stories deserve to be told, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell. Every time you engage, you help keep these stories alive and remind the world that truth, no matter how long it takes, must always come to light. By the 1990s, whispers of Georgia Tann's crimes had become a full-throated demand for acknowledgement. Survivors had spent decades searching in silence, but now their voices carried into courtrooms, state legislatures, and the national press. Former Tennessee Children's Home Society adoptees began testifying about their experiences. Some recounted being raised in loving homes but forever haunted by unanswered questions. Others told stories of abuse, neglect, and the cruel realization that their biological families had not abandoned them. They had been robbed of them. The Tennessee government, under pressure from survivors and advocates, formally acknowledged the crimes. Reports confirmed what many had long suspected. Georgia Tann had trafficked more than 5,000 children between 1924 and 1950, using forged documents, false death certificates, and outright kidnappings. The state admitted that countless lives were destroyed by one woman's empire of deceit. Memorial efforts began to take shape. Survivors, families, and advocates gathered at Elmwood Cemetery in Memphis, where 19 small children had been buried in unmarked graves during Georgia's reign. In 2015, a granite memorial was unveiled, etched with a simple but powerful inscription: "In memory of the children who died in the care of the Tennessee Children's Home Society, their names known only to God." For many, it was a long overdue acknowledgement of lives lost and pain endured. Flowers, teddy bears, and handwritten letters began appearing at the site, tokens of remembrance for children whose voices were silenced. The media revisited Georgia's story with renewed intensity. Documentaries aired on national networks, and true crime series profiled her as one of the most infamous figures in American history. Her name became shorthand for corruption in adoption practices, her story taught in universities as an example of unchecked power and systemic failure. Yet amid the pain, survivors found strength in one another. Reunions grew larger, databases expanded, and countless families were reunited through DNA testing and genealogy. The very tools that had once hidden the truth were now exposing it. Georgia Tann had stolen futures, but she could not erase love. And the bonds she tried to sever were, decades later, being restored. Do you think every state should be required to unseal all historical adoption records, no matter how painful the truth may be? By the time the 21st century arrived, Georgia Tann had been dead for half a century. Yet her crimes refused to fade into the past. Survivors and their families carried scars that no apology could erase. Stolen identities, fractured lineages, and questions that would never be answered. For many adoptees, their search for the truth was not about anger but about identity. Who were they before Georgia Tann intervened? What names were they born with? Which families had mourned them as dead, when, in fact, they had been shipped to strangers for profit? These questions defined decades of quiet pain, and also a determined movement to uncover the truth. Adoption laws in Tennessee eventually changed. The state began offering limited access to adoption records, and advocacy groups expanded networks to help survivors reunite with birth families. DNA testing accelerated the process, and one by one, broken connections were mended. Though many parents had already passed away, siblings, cousins, and grandchildren opened doors that Georgia had slammed shut. But the tragedy is not just in what Georgia Tann did. It's in what society allowed. Judges signed away children without question. Hospitals released newborns into her custody. Politicians protected her because she made adoption appear glamorous, even noble for wealthy families. It was not just one woman's crime, it was a system that looked away. Today, her story stands as both a warning and a lesson. A warning of what happens when greed is unchecked and vulnerable lives are reduced to profit. And a lesson that truth, no matter how long it is buried, has a way of rising. Survivors, once silenced children, are now the narrators of their own stories, reclaiming the voices Georgia tried to erase. At Elmwood Cemetery, where the memorial stone honors the lost, visitors often leave flowers and small toys. Each one is a reminder that these children are not forgotten. Their brief lives, once hidden in shame, are now honored in the open light. Georgia Tann is remembered as one of the most infamous criminals in American history. But the true legacy belongs to the survivors, the mothers who never stopped searching, the adoptees who found their names again, and the families who carry forward the memory of children taken too soon. Her empire collapsed, but the stories endure. And through remembrance, justice, though delayed, finds a voice. Tribute to the children. This story is dedicated to the thousands of children stolen, displaced, and lost through the Tennessee Children's Home Society under Georgia Tann, 1924 to 1950. To the infants buried in unmarked graves, to the adoptees who lived without answers, and to the families who were torn apart. Your voices matter, your names matter, and your stories will not be forgotten. May remembrance bring healing. May truth bring justice. And may future generations ensure that such a tragedy never happens again. What do you think is the most important lesson society should learn from Georgia Tann's crimes? If you followed this journey through all the story, thank you. Please remember to like, share, subscribe, and click the notification bell, so these stories and the victims at their heart are never forgotten.